Hey everybody! In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to build a two-column responsive layout using CSS Grid. This layout will be two columns on desktop and it's responsive and it stacks to one column for tablet and mobile. Sound good? Let's get into it! Okay, so I'm going to be going through building this layout step by step, so feel free to follow along in your own code editor, or you can just watch this and do it yourself later. My code editor is VS Code, and I'm just starting from an empty folder here called tutorial temp, but you can start wherever you want. First things first, index.html. And then in our index.html file, I'm going to use the emit shortcut ! Enter. Then I'll add in some boilerplate code. So let's just change the title here to two-column layout with CSS Grid. And then I'm going to just do a little h1 tag here, and we'll just have the same thing here as the title. Okay, so for now that's good. And the next thing I want to do is I want to create our Sass file. So we're just going to use one Sass file because this is a pretty simple demo. There's not too much going on here. And in our style.scss file, let's create our global styles. So in the HTML selector, one thing we want to do first is set box sizing to border box. And this setting makes sure that the padding is included in the width or height of an element, so it just makes it easier to size things. Then we're also going to do font size 100%. So lets the user control the size of their text if they zoom in or out on their browser, and it just makes it more accessible, so I always try to include that. Next, let's add some wildcard selectors. So we want pretty much any element, and we're also going to include pseudo elements before and after, and we want them to inherit the box sizing. And then let's add a body selector, and we'll just add some resets here. So I'm just going to set margin to 0, padding, let's have a little global padding here, so let's say 20 pixels. And then for our fonts, I usually like to use a sans serif font, so let's just do Arial, and then I'm going to add a little default line height of 1.3 just to make sure there's a little spacing between the lines. Now, what we want to do is in VS Code, there's an extension that I'm using called the Live Sass extension. So let me just show you that here. If you don't have it installed, called Live Sass Compiler. So if you don't have this installed, you can install it, and it will also install the Live Server extension, which lets you spin up a local website for files that you're editing in VS Code. So now, I think because I might need to close and reopen this folder, I'll show you why in a second. And if we look down in VS Code, in our bottom status bar here, you can see it says Watch Sass, and then also says Go Live. So the Watch Sass is from the Live Sass compiler, so we'll click that button. Then you can see it's watching our Sass, and it's created in this dist folder a style.css file and a Sass map file. The dist folder is a custom setting that I've added for my own Live Sass extension because I usually like to put all my compiled files in a dist folder, but you don't have to do it. By default, it'll just create it in the same location as your Sass file. Now we have our final CSS file. Let's add in our index.html, a link. This is again using the emit extension, and it's going to load dist/style.css. Okay. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to load the website in our local server. So if we click this Go Live button here, and let's bring our browser window over to here, and here's our website. Now let's go back into the styles and make a few little tweaks here. I actually want to make the body have a dark background color with white text. So we'll say background color. I'll just add a dark gray, and then we'll add a color of white. Now when we go back to our website, it's changed, and this is because of the Live Sass and the Live Server extensions. So anytime we make changes to our code, it's going to automatically update our local server, which is pretty awesome. One reason why I love VS Code. So now that we have our files and everything and our workflow set up, let's go back into our index.html file and start creating the markup for our layout. Now with CSS Grid, it is similar to Flexbox in that it requires a parent and child elements. So using sort of semantic HTML tags where we can, let's create a main element, and we want the class to be grid parent because that's where we're going to write our styles. So then in the main tag, we're going to create our 2 columns. So those are the 2 child CSS Grid items. So first we want to add a section tag. And in that, we're going to add a class of main-content. Oops, I always kind of forget that. I think I'm writing CSS when I write these Emmet shortcuts here. So this is going to be our main content in this section tag. And in this, we want to add just some placeholder text like we did last time. So we'll say h2, and we'll say main content. And then we're also going to add some paragraph tags, and some lorem ipsum text, so maybe 50 words of that. And then let's add another paragraph with lorem ipsum text. Okay, I'm gonna wrap the lines here. So Alt Z is a hotkey in VS Code to wrap the line so it's not so long. Then the second element we want to make is our sidebar. So we'll use the aside tag, and we'll give it a class of sidebar. We'll do the same thing here. We'll add an h2 tag, sidebar, and then we'll just add maybe 1 paragraph of lorem ipsum 50 words. Okay, so now let's go back and check our website. You can see now that the website's been updated with the changes that we made in our markup. So next thing that we want to do is let's kind of make this website look a little bit nicer. So I'm just going to add some nice looking backgrounds to our elements. And one good place to do that is this website called cssgradient.io. And you can just kind of look at these different gradients, and it gives you the CSS code that you can simply copy into your code. So back in our style.scss file, so I'm going to add the background to the main content element. So in our Sass file, we'll add main content using the class selector, and we're going to paste in those styles that we got. So let's check out our site. So now it's like a nice blue gradient, and we'll just pick another sort of random. Let's try this for the sidebar, or maybe this one. Copy to clipboard, and for the sidebar class, paste in those styles. So now we don't need this anymore. So now this is our website. And I'm just going to do a couple other things to kind of finesse the styles here. I'm going to add some padding, and then I'm going to make the rounded corners using the border radius. I'll just add a main content and sidebar compound selector, and we'll say padding, let's just say maybe 20 pixels all the way around, same as we had on the body. And then border radius is going to curve those corners, so we'll say 12 pixels. We'll save that. It's reloaded. And okay, now it's time to make these columns actually columns side by side using CSS grid styles. So in our style.scss file, on the grid parent selector, we can turn on grid by adding display grid. And that's kind of similar to Flexbox. However, this alone is not actually going to do anything. If we look back on our website, we can see that it's basically unchanged, even though in the grid parent element, it has the display grid rule. And that's because with grid, you actually need to designate what the template is, meaning the arrangement and size of rows and columns in your grid, before it'll sort of move the grid child elements into that arrangement. So the layout that we want is a 2-column layout. So we want 2 columns. And the way we can do that is in the property grid template columns, we designate here how many columns and what size. So what we're going to do is we're going to set grid template columns to 1FR, 1FR. Now what this means is there's 2 different numbers here, and each of them corresponds to a column. So since we want 2 columns, we have 2 numbers here. If we wanted more, let's say we wanted 5 columns, this would add 5 columns of 1FR. Now you might be curious about what this FR unit is, and FR is short for fraction. So what that means is it'll divide up the space that the grid child items take up between them based on the available width of the parent and the number of FR units that it takes. So since the number is the same, that means that both these child grid elements are going to be the same width. So if we go back to our site, you can see that they are side by side in 2 columns and they are the same width. Now, another property that you can use in grid is the gap property. And this is going to add space between the grid child items. So now you can see that in our grid parent, there is space between the main content and the sidebar of 20 pixels. And this property is really helpful because it's intelligent enough that it's only going to add space between the items in the grid. It's not going to add space, around the edges, because you can see the main content and the sidebar go all the way out to the edges. So it's pretty helpful like that. Let's take a look now at the Firefox Grid Inspector. So in the inspector, make sure you've selected the grid parent up here, and then go to the Layout tab on the bottom. And you can see that in the grid section, if you make sure it's expanded, it has detected that we have a grid parent element, and that's the main tag that we created. So when you click this checkbox here, you can see that on the website itself, some lines appear. You can also change the color of the line if you want. I'm just gonna keep it on white just to contrast with the background. Under the overlay grid area, let me kind of move that up so you can see it better, but there's actually a little diagram of the grid. And if you hover over the columns or rows that you've created, it will highlight them on the actual web page itself. So in the grid and the website, we can see the lines. We can also see that gap, or the gutter it's called, between the 2 grid child elements, and it's slightly shaded. You should be able to see that hopefully. And there's also, going around, you can see that the lines are labeled with these little tags. So starting from, if we look at the vertical lines, starting from the left side, it's numbered 1, 2, and then the last one is 3. And I think maybe we can't see that because of my zoom level. Yeah, so you can see at the very end it's 3, but since I've zoomed in, it disappears. Yeah, going from left to right, it goes from 1 to 2 to 3, and then also the horizontal rows, the lines between the rows, it starts from the top, so 1, and the bottom one is 2. And there are also some negative numbers here, but we're going to kind of get into those later. So this main content section will span between the lines 1 up to 2. And then the sidebar is going to span the grid column line 2 up to the last one, 3. And you can kind of think of it the same way with the rows. So the main content is going to span the row from the grid line 1 to 2, and the sidebar will do the same since they're on the same row. So in our grid, it automatically populated the grid child items going from left to right. So if you don't designate it, they're going to put them into columns. And if we had more items in multiple rows, it would probably populate them from the top to the bottom. Now, if you want more control over how the grid child items are positioned in the grid, you can position them in specific sections of the grid template. We only have a 2-column, 1-row layout, so there's not much difference that you can add now, but if you had multiple columns and multiple rows along with several grid items, you might want a little bit more control over that. And you can even have a grid child item span more than 1 column or row. So let's experiment a little bit just for the sake of exploring what you can do with grid. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to make my grid template a little bit bigger. So maybe, let's say 3 by 3. So in the Firefox Inspector, we're just going to make these changes directly in the browser. So if we select the grid parent, click on Rules, let's update our grid template columns. And I'm just going to kind of overwrite our saved styles with some inline styles. So we're going to change the grid template columns property to use the repeat function. And we'll say 3, 1fr. Now what that does is this repeat function will repeat 3 times and create 3 columns of 1fr width. So we're going to add another rule to add more rows, and we'll say grid template rows. And we'll do the same thing, repeat 3, 1fr. Okay, so now it's a bit harder to see this, but we have a grid template that has 3 columns and 3 rows. You can also, in the grid template columns and grid template rows properties, combine a repeat with other static set columns. So let's say for the grid template columns, if we added a 500 pixel column before the repeat, what's happened now is the first column is going to be 500 pixels wide, and then with the remaining space, it's created 3 additional columns using that repeat function. And since they're all 1FR, they're going to have the rest of the space divided up equally between them. So one more really cool and powerful feature of CSS Grid is that you can place grid child items in any cell of the grid, a cell being the square created by the horizontal and vertical lines in the template. So let's say that we wanted to put the sidebar in the last 2 columns of the first row. So how we would do that would be in our inspector. We're just going to add some more inline styles here. So we're going to select the sidebar element, and then we're going to add a new rule, and the property is going to be grid-column. And we're going to say 3/5. Now you can see it moved over, but what this is the grid column property is actually a shorthand property. So it's shorthand for grid column start and grid column end. And you can use the grid line numbers to place the grid item between these specific grid lines. So in our case, we're placing the sidebar between grid column lines 3 and 5. And there is another way that you can write this, and that is grid column -1/-3. Now it looks the same, but do you remember earlier we had mentioned that the grid lines starting from the left, it goes from 1 and then 2, 3, 4, 5, and it kind of numbers up. Well, using negative numbers, you can sort of number the grid lines a different way. So starting from the far right, the first one's going to be -1, and it's going to go down. So the next one moving to the left is going to be -2, -3, -4, -5. So this does mean that any given grid line in a template is going to have both a positive and a negative number. And these are for the lines that we have sort of explicitly set using our grid template row, column and grid template row properties in the parent. So these are the lines that we've explicitly set up here in the grid template. And there is yet another way that you can write this and position this sidebar. And that is going to be grid column again. Column, and we'll go back to positive numbers here. So 3/, but instead of 5 like we did the first time, we're going to say span 2. Now what this is doing is it's saying it's starting at grid column 3, grid column line 3, and then instead of saying the line that we want the sidebar element to end on, we're simply going to tell it to span 2 columns, and that's where the span 2 comes from. If we had it to span 1, oops, up here. If we set it to span 1, it would just take up 1 column, starting from 3, but we have it set to span 2. You know, if we wanted to also, let's say, make the sidebar in the second row instead of the first row, we can do the same thing, but instead of grid column, we're going to say grid row. So much the same way with the grid column property, this grid row property is shorthand for grid row start and grid row end. So to put it in the second row, and the row line numbers start from the top, 1, 2, 3. So we want the sidebar to be between 1, 2, row 2, and row line 2, I should say, and then the grid column, grid row line 3. So we'll say grid row 2/3. And of course, we can do the span thing as well if we wanted to, span 1. Or if we change it to span 2 for grid row, we can now see that it's taking up 2 rows and 2 columns. These are just some of the basics when it comes to CSS Grid. It is a pretty powerful, complex way of building website layouts, and it's definitely worth learning if you haven't done it yet. All right, now that we've covered some of the basic things you can do with CSS Grid, let's build that 2-column layout. So first, let's review how we want this layout to behave. On mobile and tablet, we want to stack the 2 columns so that the main content is going to be on top of the sidebar, and the sidebar will stack below it, and both are going to be full width. Then for desktop, we want to put the content into 2 columns like we had earlier, main content on the left and sidebar on the right, and we want the sidebar to always be 300 pixels wide, and the main content will take up whatever is rest in the available space. So let's go into our style.scss file and write our mobile styles first. So since we are changing the grid template from the 2 columns that we had earlier, we want to change the grid template columns property to just be 1 column by default. So we can do this by changing it to 1FR. So if we go back into our website, we can see that now the 2 content blocks have stacked into 1 column. So that's all we need for mobile and tablet. And for our desktop columns, we want to trigger those desktop styles at, when we hit a certain viewport width. So we want to add a media query for that. And then our media feature rule that we're going to target is going to be min width. And we're going to do 900 pixels for that. Also, we want to write our min width in not pixels, but in EMs because it's a little bit more accessible. So you can get from 900 pixels to EMs by dividing by 16. 16 because that's the default font size in your browser, and 1 EM is going to be whatever that is. So 16 pixels is going to equal 1 EM in our case. So if we divide 900 by 16, which I did do earlier, we're going to get 56.25 EMs. So in this media query, we're going to add our desktop grid template. So grid template columns. And the first column is going to be that left column for the main content, and we want it to be able to be flexible to take up whatever space is available. So we're setting that to 1 FR. And then for the second column, it's going to be that 300 pixel wide sidebar column. So there's our rule. Now let's check out our website and see if everything works the way we want it to. Okay, so we got our 2-column layout here, and the sidebar's 300 pixels. Main content's taking up whatever space is left. Let's test that a little bit. So yeah, you can see the sidebar stays the same no matter what the viewport is. And as we decrease the viewport, it is going to stack and it's full width. So it looks like this is behaving exactly the way we want it to. And that's it for building our responsive layout using Grid. If this video helped you at all, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, you can always leave a comment down below. And as always, thanks for watching and keep on coding.